the South African Police Service awarded a major health risk management contract to Medicare 24 Tshwane District, a company linked to Vusimuzi cat Matlala. The contract was often described publicly as a 360 million rand tender. In court, the state would later place the awarded amount at about 228 million rand. It was meant to handle sensitive health-related assessments for SAPS employees. But less than a year after it was awarded, SAPS terminated it. Not because the work had ended, not because a replacement provider had taken over, but because SAPS' own review raised serious questions about how the contract had been awarded, how the bid had been evaluated, and whether the service was being delivered properly. So how did this contract survive procurement, and why did it later become the doorway into arrests, criminal charges, and a plea deal? To understand how it fell apart, we go back to December 2024. By then, concerns about the tender were no longer sitting quietly inside procurement files. Media reports were circulating, questions were being asked, and those questions reached Police Minister Senzo Mchunu. On the 24th of December 2024, National Police Commissioner Fanny Masemola met Minister Mchunu. After that meeting, Masemola instructed SAPS internal audit and risk management to review the contract. That decision changed the story. SAPS was no longer asking only whether the company had won the tender. It was asking whether the company should have won it. In January 2025, the preliminary internal audit raised red flags. According to evidence later placed before Parliament, the Bid Evaluation Committee did not have the necessary skill and competence to evaluate the bid properly. There was no evidence of individual scoring in the bid file. The due diligence process had weaknesses, and there were concerns about misrepresentation, fronting, and corruption risk. This is where the contract stopped looking like an ordinary procurement dispute. It started looking like a process that may have been compromised before the award was even made. The audit pointed to weaknesses in the machinery that produced the award: the evaluators, the scoring records, the checks on the bidder, and the due diligence that should have asked harder questions. There was also another problem. Concerns about Cat Matlala had already existed before the contract was awarded. According to evidence before Parliament, the National Commissioner had been warned about concerns involving the company, including alleged links to the Tembisa hospital matter. But those concerns did not stop the award. The tender process continued, the contract was approved, and the company was appointed. So when SAPS's own audit later raised concerns, the question became sharper. Were the warning signs missed, or were they ignored? At the same time, SAPS says the service itself was not performing as expected. Medical reports remained outstanding, assessments were delayed, and backlogs were growing. SAPS said about 634 employees remained on prolonged sick leave because decisions could not be made without the necessary medical reports. So the contract was under pressure from two sides: the process that created it and the performance that followed it. Then another question emerged. What role was Cat Matlala still playing? According to SAPS, Matlala was the sole director when the contract was awarded. He later resigned, and another director was appointed. But SAPS says it was not informed of that change. Even after the resignation, SAPS alleged that Matlala continued engaging SAPS personnel about the execution of the contract. If Matlala was no longer the director, why was he still involved? And if someone else was formally in charge, who was really controlling the company? SAPS also looked at Brigadier Lenono. Lenono was still an active SAPS member when she served on the Bid Evaluation Committee that examined the bids and later recommended Medicare 24 Tshwane District. She then resigned from SAPS around the time the award was finalized. After that, she was linked to the same company whose bid she had helped evaluate. For SAPS, the concern was the sequence. She evaluated the bid, the company benefited, and later she became connected to that company. By this stage, the story had moved beyond paperwork. It was now about possible conflicts, fronting, misrepresentation, and insider influence. In April 2025, the final internal audit and risk report confirmed the preliminary concerns. It recommended disciplinary action against members of the Bid Evaluation Committee and the Bid Adjudication Committee. A forensic investigation was also initiated. The question was no longer only whether the contract should be canceled. The question was, who should be held responsible? Then came the final decision. On the 13th of May, 2025, SAPS formally terminated the contract. According to SAPS, the company appeared to have abused the supply chain management system and engaged in fraudulent or corrupt practices when competing for the contract. The termination was based on misrepresentation, fronting, integrity concerns, potential conflicts, performance failures, and the audit findings. Less than a year after the contract was awarded, it was over. But the story did not end with cancellation. The forensic work continued. The audit trail became an investigation. The investigation became a criminal case. And eventually, Kat Matlala and senior SAPS officials would find themselves in court. At first, Matlala pushed back. His position was that the company had competed for the tender legitimately and that the SAPS contract should be separated from the other controversies around him. But the case did not stay in denial. It moved into court. And once it did, the story changed. Matlala entered into a plea and sentencing agreement with the state. He pleaded guilty to fraud, corruption, and money laundering charges linked to the irregular awarding of the SAPS contract. That plea changed the weight of everything that came before it. The audit findings were no longer just warnings. The missing records were no longer just gaps. The performance failures were no longer just service delivery problems. The terminated contract had become the first visible crack in something much larger. It exposed questions about the people inside the system. Who opened the door? Who looked away? Who benefited? And how far did the influence reach? That is why this contract matters. A health services tender became a corruption case. A canceled contract became a courtroom matter. And a man who initially denied wrongdoing became a state witness through a plea deal. So when SAPS terminated the Medicare 24 contract in May 2025, it may have looked like the closing of a file. But behind that tender were officials, influence, money, criminal charges, and finally, a plea deal. The contract ended, but the story it exposed was only beginning.